is my privilege to welcome Dr. Dallas Willard to the podium of Socrates in the City. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had been forewarned that the introduction would be better than the talk. So I have steeled myself to go on no matter what. The topic that we have selected, I selected in consultation with Eric. It is a big one, and it is an important one, and I promise I will try to make it as accessible as possible. A part of my strategy is to make available a set of notes that you can more or less follow, and they will enable you to hold on to some of the sentences that may be a little more complicated than you would like to hear. Often philosophers are hated for good reason, and putting it down in writing is, if you want to, then you can look at it again. But this is a tremendously important issue. Are reason and spirituality compatible? And we can put it in plainer English by simply saying, are Christians nuts? And we could extend that to other forms of spirituality if you wish. The answer, by the way, is no. But Socrates asked this question relentlessly in Athens. How should we live? And really the question is it possible to have an answer that is rational and reasonable to that question? And Socrates understood very well that only the correct deployment of reason and spirituality in cooperation with each other could answer this question as it should be answered. Spirituality and reason or knowledge are not only compatible, they are made to work together, and if they don't, neither one will work on its own. You have to have both of them. They are made for one another. Now today, historical forces coming past 3 centuries or so have tried to force them apart and in opposition. Spirituality is thought often as a matter of feeling, or perhaps you use the word faith. But faith is taken now in our culture normally to be exclusive of reason. The Archer Bunker definition of faith is what you wouldn't believe for your life if it wasn't in the Bible. Right? And the idea is now you have left knowledge, you have left reason aside. Spirituality, faith, are thought of as arbitrary decisions at best, and people are patronized by saying, oh, that's a nice leap of faith. Unfortunately, I can't make it. As if you should pat them on the head and say, so sorry, right? And that's the attitude that forces a deadly opposition between faith and knowledge, which now reigns in much of our country, and especially in the academic setting. So now, as philosophers are apt to do, I want to start out by trying to say, first of all, what spirituality is and what is spirit, and then what is knowledge or reason, and then we'll talk some about how they go together. So if you're looking at point 3 on your handout, spirituality is first of all something that is non-physical. And for many people that's enough to dismiss it. But that is a dismissal of pure ignorance and needs to be challenged and followed up on. Often today, if something is not given to sense perception or the sciences, as people misunderstandingly say, is simply something that you can't deal with. So what is left out when you take that position, that anything that is not given in sense perception or by some extension of the sciences is not something that falls in the field of reason or of knowledge, a common assumption. So let's start with this, that the spiritual is first of all something that is non-physical. Now, I hasten to say that's you, among other things, so don't lose hope. You're not physical. You are a consciousness. And that's what actually matters about human life, is consciousness. But we won't have time to deal with that very fully, but I want to say that. So the second thing we say about the spiritual is that it is personal. It involves what makes persons persons. Start with simple consciousness, but thoughts, creativity, ability to invent and to imagine, to experience and to remember. All of that is spiritual as well. So I try a description here. I put it in bold print so you can not miss it. Try the thinking of the Spirit as unbodily, personal power. Doesn't say that it has nothing to do with the body. It has much to do with body, but it doesn't derive from body. So if all you have are the sciences of body, physics, chemistry, maybe biology, it depends on how you interpret life, you will never get to the spiritual. So now look at the list, please. In various ways, spirit and spiritual are manifested in self-awareness. That's the first place you encounter it. Art, in the creation and in the experience. Morality, intention and character. Meaning, gifts of transition, whether you find it in language or you find it in your life. A situation can be meaningful. If it is, it brings a gift of transition, the power to move us onward. And when you're caught in a meaningless situation, the one thing that is missing is movement. And to be stuck there is not a pleasant thing. And of course, many people complain about the meaninglessness of their job or the meaninglessness of life. And so that's where that comes in. Finally, religion, or transcendental intrusions into life. Now that's a list of things that fall under the heading of the spiritual. That's why, for example, when you see someone give up on religion, they may flee to art. And art is a substitute religion for many people in our culture. And frankly, it makes sense. If you are a person who is able to be involved in and to appreciate art, you can understand how it would offer a kind of meaning to your existence that would allow you to tolerate a godless universe. So that's the picture now. All of these derive from and largely consist in what is non-physical and personal. Now you're going to have time to jaw back at me about this, so don't give up. Okay, art, for example, consists in mastery and employment of the physical, sense-perceptible medium for the expression of a human vision of realities and values, which are then made available, as otherwise they would not be. That's why art is so important and so precious, is then made available to a public that is able to enter into the experience of those realities and values in ways that give understanding and stimulation and indeed a vision and an ability to see things that you couldn't see before. That's why Oscar Wilde famously said, nature imitates art. Because if you experience art in certain ways, you suddenly became able to see things like fog-covered seascapes or whatever it is that you never saw before. And art is a precious gift of meaning. But you know what? It's not physical, and it's not sense-perceptible, and it's not impersonal. Morality has to do with intentions of good and evil settled into character, and even into the bodies and the life arrangements of good and bad people of varying degrees. Intentions and character are manifested in actions and in social arrangements. I won't have time to develop this very far, but because of this problem about spirituality and knowledge or reason, we now have a society that is bereft of moral knowledge. And that is one of the things that you lose when you get the wrong view of what knowledge is. But now, this question forces itself forward. Are these areas of spirituality accessible to reason, rightly deployed, resulting in knowledge? Can you have knowledge that Raphael is a greater painter than some other person that you might like to mention? Or do you judge art simply in terms of how much money it's worth? There was a segment on 60 Minutes a week or so ago which was on art. The only thing they discussed was the economics of art. And that's generally what people understand. And if you can get enough money for it, it's art, baby. And if you can get a lot of money for it, it's better art. Right? That's where you're left when you preclude knowledge or spirituality from the realm of knowledge. So, are these areas of spirituality accessible to reason rightly deployed? No is the response generally assumed today. And if you can sell a piece of junk as art, it is art. But this leaves us with no rational and reliable guidance of life. And for most human history, the answer has been emphatically yes. These areas of spirituality are accessible to reason, rightly deployed. And in the time of Socrates and Plato, they were the only things that could genuinely be known and that reason could get a hold of. That's what a turnaround we've seen through the generations, from a time where the sense-perceptible world was not something that could be known. Some of you will understand Plato's arguments for that. I'm not going to lay them on you tonight. To a point where only what is sense-perceptible can be known. And you have to understand what is lost when that happens. Certainly for Socrates, Plato, and nearly all of the great thinkers recognized in the history of thought, Descartes, Locke, Kant. Yes was the answer to that question, and an absolutely vital answer to the question, are these areas of spirituality accessible to reason, resulting in knowledge? So we have to ask the question, were they stupid? Or are we today totally misguided? Now, let's talk about knowledge. Of course, knowledge is what you get when you apply reason. You have knowledge of something if you're able, hold on to your seat now because I'm going to give you a description here. You have knowledge of something if you're able to represent it, speak about it, deal with it as it is on the appropriate basis of thought and experience. This is a description of knowledge as it functions in life, because actually knowledge is not rare and it's not esoteric. One of the myths that spins out of the academic world, primarily through philosophy, but also through various of the other humanities, is the idea that knowledge is rare. You might not even know you have a nose. And if you're sitting in a philosophy classroom, someone can probably get you to thinking you don't know that. Right? Now, if you don't know you have a nose, you're in a bad position. Of course, you forget it when you walk out of that room, because knowledge is very common. You know more than you could ever say, and it is not esoteric. Knowledge is what you require of your dentist. You don't want your dentist to have faith and feeling about your teeth. Right? You want them to know that that tooth needs such and such treatment. You want that in your automobile mechanic. You wouldn't take your car to a shop that said, we're lucky at making repairs. You want them to know. See, it's very common, very commonsensical. And in these big questions, you do want to stay as close as possible to common sense. Knowledge of any subject matter is gained by bringing it before the mind in whatever way is suitable, and by logically examining its properties and its relations in all the ways possible, formulating judgments about it, and logically organizing and testing them in ways which that peculiar subject matter allows. Every subject matter dictates the method by which it is to be known. You don't go with your method already there and put it on the subject matter. And if you do, you'll mess up the subject matter and probably wind up explaining it away. And if it's something important to you, that's a real problem. Most of human life runs in terms of things that have to be explained away if you get the wrong view of knowledge. So if you're in a field like astronomy, there are methods. You can come to know things. You can get it wrong, but then you can get it right. If you're in a field like astrology, there's almost nothing that you can do to make sure that you're right or you're wrong. One is a field of genuine knowledge, which historically arose out of the other one, which genuinely is not. So you can have fun with it, but you can't establish anything as an area of knowledge in astrology. Now here's what's really, this is where the trouble begins. This is your note 10 at the bottom of your page there. Because the real struggle here is over authority. Who has authority? And that's as common as your most recent news from the Congress. Because the struggle is always over who knows. Who knows what Obamacare will do? And you might be tempted at this point to say no one knows. And that might be right. But people claim to know. In our culture, our Congress people often claim to know enough to vote on a bill that they haven't read. But if you confront them with it and say, well, you don't even know what this bill says, they have a long explanation. Hopefully someone has read it. That's the importance of knowledge. So now this note is very important. Possession of knowledge conveys to the one who knows in a given area rights and responsibilities to act, direct action, formulate policy and supervise its implementation, and to teach. That's what knowledge does. Faith does not do that unless it is also knowledge. Feeling does not do that. Tradition does not do that. But you see, because it is so important, people will claim knowledge where they don't have it. Because of the recognition of the importance of having knowledge and the fact that knowledge does, in fact, authorize people to act in things that matter a great deal for human beings. So this is why knowledge and claims to knowledge are so important, but also are so contested among human beings. Knowledge opens possibilities of harmonious relations with reality. And reality is something you don't want to run into. And so knowledge helps you have harmonious relationships with reality. That's why it's so important. Now, also, next page, knowledge and the hope for knowledge opens up common ground for cooperation in shared activities and for discussion and possible resolution of differences and disagreements. If no knowledge is possible, all of these are ruled out. And this is very much the position we find ourselves in today, and one reason why we live in the middle of a politics of contempt. It is because people no longer have hope of common ground on which to meet to find out what is the case. Socrates was notable for many things. One of the things was his claim that if you correct where he is wrong, you have done him a favor. That's the mark of a wise person in the book of Proverbs in the Bible. A wise person is one who is thankful to you when you correct them. But you see, if there's no knowledge in an area like meaning, art, government, whatever, human areas, if there's no knowledge, there's no common ground. There's no place to meet. And when you abandon that, as we as a society have done with reference especially to morality, when you abandon that, then there's nothing left but conflict. Force, power. If no knowledge is possible, resolution, common ground, and so on, are ruled out. And then force alone rules. Only knowledge lays the foundation for tolerance, because it provides a common ground upon which people, or at least a hope for common ground, upon which people who are reasonable can meet and work out their agreements and their disagreements. Now, the effect of ruling the spiritual out of the domain of reason and knowledge is to leave the most important matters of human life at the mercy of force, drift, human arbitrariness, and feeling, with no rational direction of their development, classification, or ordering. So far as human events now stand, that is where we are. Because if you do not have knowledge of the things that fall in the spiritual realm, you have no guidance. And only arbitrariness and force can guide you to where you wind up. And for those who disagree with you, there is no place to meet to decide who is right and who is wrong. That's a deplorable condition to be in. So, as far as human events now stand, people say that's how things must be. Now, why did they say that? They say that because of the historically developing perception of knowledge in relation to things that are spiritual. And that is rooted in the conflicts between modern thought and religious authority in the history of the Western people. And that is what has driven this idea. And the idea was we need to rule out religion as a place of knowledge. But when they had that ruled out, they found they lost a lot of other things in the American history of education. At a certain point in the late 1800s, it was discovered, if you wish, that theology was not a subject of knowledge. And so that was pushed out of the curriculum. And then they said, where will we locate ethics? And this is a long story that is told in a book by Julie Rubin, I hope you might look at, called The Making of the Modern University, where she just tells soberly the documentary history of the developments of curriculum in the universities. But one of the things that comes out is no place has been found for moral knowledge. And that is why our universities and our higher educational institutions, and of course they're influential over our professional organizations and much else, our popular culture, that is why there is no knowledge of moral reality, of who is good and who is bad, of what's right and what's wrong, of what obligations and duties are. For that matter, who is a saint and who is a hero. Works of supererogation, as we call them, beyond what you ought to do. There is no knowledge of that. So our question is, shall we accept it? Point 13 on your sheet, is there a way back? And my answer is, only if responsible and visible groups of people, institutions, what we are dealing with is an institutional problem now. Only institutions can respond. If institutions are willing to develop an intelligible and defensible understanding of what knowledge is, you cannot avoid that question of how it is gained and present the spiritual realities with which they are concerned as subjects of knowledge that they actually possess. That would be hard to do. Knowledge functioning in human affairs has to be grounded in institutions. It's not a private thing. Of course, individuals have to participate in it. But that, so far as the spiritual is concerned, is exactly what is now lacking in our knowledge institutions, universities, and their offshoots. Our university faculties are now socialized by their training and confirmed by their professionalized setting against knowledge in the spiritual areas. It could be professional death for an individual to claim knowledge in those areas. especially with respect to religion. There is little hope or no hope of change in current attitudes towards this tremendously important issue, towards reason and spirituality, arising from the universities in general. You can study spirituality as a social phenomenon, but not as something that deals with realities. But institutions of higher education that are explicitly and strongly identified with the historical Christian movement might be able to do something about the situation if they would come together around the project of reversing the expulsion of the content of their faith from the domain of knowledge. And that, of course, would lead over into the other things which I've described as spiritual, especially morals and art, but also self-understanding, self-knowledge, especially with reference to the existence of God, the spiritual nature of the human person, and the resurrection of Christ. Now, at this point, a hush settles over the room. It's almost as if I had said something obscene. That's because I'm getting to the quick of your minds. So you are sensitive about this issue. That's why I held off on religion till now, because I hope to get you involved in the discussion about meaning with an understanding that it's much broader than religion. Such institutions would then explicitly develop and defend an intelligible and realistic understanding of what knowledge is, and they would then present the basic contents of Christian teaching, mere Christianity as it has been called, as knowledge, to which everyone is responsible because it presents realities with which all must deal. They would publicly and reasonably declare all of this in ways wise and possible, even before doubting and hostile onlookers, including accreditation committees. So let's conclude with this. Only in a universe of a certain sort can knowledge, reason, and spirituality be at home with one another. And that is pretty much the consensus of the greatest thinkers from Socrates to Kant. I could go beyond that, but it becomes more difficult to discuss it. Only a universe of a certain sort, in a universe of a certain sort, can knowledge or reason and spirituality be at home with one another, and each function in relation to the other as is intended by their very nature. Given that, there would be a possibility of understanding how spirituality and rationality, spirituality is rational and reason is spiritual. And see, if you were to say that to someone like Plato or Socrates, they would say, yes, what else is new? Because that's what they understood. Kant understood that. And so on for many of the greatest thinkers that we've had. How spirituality is rational and reason is spiritual, and of framing individual and social existence around their unity in a life guided by knowledge of what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. So, in summary, properly understood, reason and spirituality call out for one another and serve one another in a life guided and informed by aims and habits that characterize a flourishing human existence. This stands forth clearly in the classical and biblical sources which still nourish what is best in contemporary life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Willard. Yeah, I'm going to answer the hard questions, and then you. Okay. It's our tradition at Socrates in the City, as I mentioned earlier, to have Q&A. You just get to do the Q part. Dr. Willard will be covering A over the evening. They're setting up the microphones here. It's our tradition also at Socrates in the City to demand that you phrase your question in the form of a question. I hate to be a stickler. I hate to tell you how to live, but that's just something we've been doing for years. Questions in the form of a question. If you can keep it to 14 syllables, you get a free book. In any case, that's where we are. And Dallas Willard, Dr. Willard, told me up front that he prefers true or false questions. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Please.
Actually, I said the hard questions are the best ones, and we'll just do the best we can. Thank you, Eric.
We can go on? Yeah, okay. My question is, if I may, we start with a statement, Eric, forgive me. It's I'm alienated by the modern art, what we consider like probably half of 40 or 70% of the people in the room. But nevertheless, to decide the value of something, if not the market, we should appoint a tsar, an art czar that decide what's good and bad, or something else. I understand if I was born in 1850, probably what is abstract, art, the 1900s starting, would look like an aberration. Sure. And probably still is for a lot of people. I want to know that you address the art issue. It's very confusing how we decide the value. I know the monetary look trivial, but what else is there? Thank you.
In order to deal with that, I certainly don't recommend an art czar, because the problem would be find someone who knew what they were doing. And that's not easy. You have to go into the nature of art, what is art designed to do, and I certainly don't want to be understood as someone who rejects abstract art or modern art in any of its forms. On the other hand, just the fact that a piece of art is not, as we might say, representative does not mean that it's good. So then you have to ask, what is the function of art? And, that's a big issue. Let me just say, I think if you will look at the cases, you will discover the function of the arts is to make available to people a vision of values and feelings that they cannot experience just given the ordinary world. And that would apply to literary works of art, painting, music, and so forth. And often there is a need for radical departures from forms that art has taken. You have to know what you're doing when you look at a piece of art, and merely the fact that you have good eyesight doesn't mean that you can see. So you have to ask the question, what is the function of art? And if you believe that the function of art is to present a profound vision and profound feelings of things that are important to human beings, whether it's death or a bowl of fruit, then you have a basis upon which to decide whether or not a piece of art performs that function. And you are able to escape the idea that if it's a novel, it must be good, because all sorts of novel stuff is not good art. And the fact that the artist is starving doesn't prove that he's a Cézanne or someone. So basically you have to go into the nature of art. You have to decide what it's about. Same question with reference to character, moral rectitude, intentions, and so on. You have to understand them. And teaching ethics doesn't mean telling people what they have to do. It means helping them understand what they're going to do and how it affects themselves and others and their future. And the most important question, I believe, in ethics is, what kind of person are you going to become? That's a real big one. We were talking over at the college today about Saving Private Ryan. I hope you know that story, because it comes down, Private Ryan comes back, visits the grave of his old lieutenant, who said, as he died, "Earn it." And the question at the end is, Private Ryan, now elderly, turns with tears to his wife and says, "Have I been a good person?" Well, we need to know what a good person is to answer that. And moral instruction should help us. So in general, the answer is there are all kinds of indications if you understand what art is. But you have to understand what art is. The same thing is true in all areas of spirituality. It isn't enough to understand yourself just to reflect on the fact that you're now hearing me talk. That is spiritual. Hearing is a spiritual reality. But to understand yourself, you have to have a lot deeper understanding. The same thing is true with reference to God. You don't flip a coin. You have to seek knowledge. But if you're told at the outset, no knowledge is available, you won't seek it. And your belief that there's no knowledge will confirm itself to you, but not to humanity in general.
Dr. Willard, is spirituality innate, universal, and if it is, does it invariably lead to a desire for transcendent God truth?
Well, I think it does. See, human beings are the kind of being that lives with a horizon. And the horizon indicates the transcendental. Now, what you make of it is going to be up to how you were educated and raised, and then what you're willing to do in seeking the transcendental. But religion is tied to the transcendental. And one of the interesting things you find now in the academy and in the culture generally is an attempt to interpret religion in such a way that it doesn't have to be transcendental. See, that is because of the assumption that if it is transcendental, you can have no knowledge of it, right? And so then you wind up with intriguing stories about the spot in your brain that produces religious experiences. No doubt there's a spot in your brain for all of your experiences and all that, but that doesn't answer the question about the reality of what you're experiencing. You still have to deal with that as a separate issue, because whatever God is, he's not a spot in your brain. And whatever moral rectitude is, it's not a spot in your brain. But see, brain science now is so big because it's physical, they think. And you can get a grant to study it. Someone else?
Dr. Willard, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Zachary Cochran, and alumnus of the King's College. Quick question. It's pretty clear, I think, what growing in knowledge is, but what would you say spiritual growth is?
Well, spiritual growth, now you're going to have to talk of a particular spirituality, and of course I would want to talk about Christian spirituality. And I define spirituality in those terms as the capacity to draw upon a spiritual source. And growth in spirituality is growth in that ability to draw on a spiritual source. For a Christian, that would mean the Trinity, basically. And so the New Testament talks about growing in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. That means increasingly now you have a resource that is not of the physical world from which you can live. The effect of that would be an expansion of knowledge, but more importantly, a growth in your capacity to love, and to love others, and to love even those who hate you, and even to love those who bug you. Right. So basically that's what growth in spirituality means for the Christian. Now, if you're a Buddhist or if you're into Wicca, which is contemporary witchcraft, you got a different source. A book was written some years ago, The Office Witch, and it was a story about how you could influence copy machines and other electronic devices by hanging symbols and words around. See that? Pyramids, crystals, and things of that sort. See, that's a reflection of the same thing. A spirituality in general is a teaching about how to access resources that are not in the physical realm. Now, any spirituality you want will fit that description. So that's how I would answer that. Very important question. You have to say what kind of spirituality it is, and then you can say what growth in that means.
Dr. Willard, again, thank you for being with us tonight. We have heard from atheists, of course, that theology is a non-subject.
Right.
We are hearing also more that philosophy is a non-subject.
A natural progression.
Could you just spend a moment justifying the use of philosophy, especially as you've devoted your life to it?
Well, philosophy, again, you have to say what it is, okay? And given some descriptions of it in the present academic setting, you can understand why people might think it is a non-subject. But philosophy, strictly speaking, is the attempt to find out by reason what is best, the best way to live. Now, you can make progress in that. And anyone who thought that the blessed life was having an endless supply of strawberry milkshakes would probably have made a mistake. Now, that's a trivial example. Possibly you can remember it. But for example, people who think that the wise and best way to live is to secure yourself financially, they're making a mistake. It's better to do that than to secure yourself with strawberry milkshakes. But it will not answer the questions of meaning and purpose of the human being, why they live, what makes for a good life. Philosophy, just in terms of the word, means rational pursuit of wisdom. And anyone who wishes to make progress in that can do so and satisfy themselves as to the worth of doing it. Our contemporary work in philosophy in the academy does not do that. And that's because people have felt the professional need to reduce it to a technical enterprise that has primarily to do with language. And if that's all there is to inquire in, it won't help you much. Now, European philosophy traditionally has taken a different view, which is more in harmony with the classical tradition of philosophy. And that's why even today, freshmen and sophomores get excited about existentialism. They don't get excited about logical positivism. And when you know the content, you understand why. They think that existentialism has something to do with wisdom about how to live, and you can actually learn a great deal from it. Now, theology is another topic, and I would want to say the same thing is true of theology if you approach it rightly.
Thank you, Dr. Willard. You said, I think, that we don't want to collide with reality, I think is one of the things you said.
It's unfortunate.
And I understand what you're saying. You mentioned the resurrection.
Right.
Now, we've just celebrated Easter.
Right. That's why I mentioned it.
Which I appreciate. And it seems to me that this is the central, part of the truth claim of Christianity is the resurrection. And yet, it asks us to suspend all of the laws that we hold true in the physical world. How do we reconcile these two realities without doing damage to either one of them?
I don't think it tells us to suspend any law that we know of. I mean, we have a generalization that dead people don't come back to life. Well, in the first place, that's not what happened in the resurrection. The Christian teaching is that a person never dies who has faith in Christ. Something happens, and then we who continue in this world have to deal with the residual of the person who was here, but they don't cease to exist. Right? Jesus didn't cease to exist when he died on the cross. He continued to exist. And when the resurrection occurred, it was not the same old body coming back to life. It was the transformation of the body into something quite different. So the real issue here is whether or not any physical laws are broken. And my challenge to anyone who thinks that a physical law is broken is to find a piece of peer-reviewed research in physics or biology or any scientific field that has coming out the end of the pipe No resurrection. See, when we hear someone say, science says such and such, we always say to them, where? Who made that discovery? You don't take it as obvious. Now, we should say the same thing if someone says, religion says such and such, or whoever says such and such. Look at the details. What is the evidence that the resurrection of Christ was contrary to the laws of physics? Do you know of anyone, any physics book that has demonstrated that? Oh, I know a lot of people who say that, but saying it is one thing, showing it to be true is another. See, science has become the great authority in many people's lives. And they say, well, science says, but science doesn't say anything. People say things, right? So a scientist might say that, or there's a lovely piece of language in our culture today, scientifically minded people. Now, it turns out you can be a scientifically minded person and have no credentials in science at all. And this is almost an occupational hazard among philosophers, many of whom have been recently writing books on this. Scientists say things, and they should be held responsible for what they say, just like theologians should be. Anyone should be responsible for what they say. And unfortunately, that has become something of a lost practice in our culture. And now you can say it in the blogmosphere, or whatever you call it. And a lot of dumb people will think because they found it there, it must have some significance. It may have no significance at all. What's the evidence? Now, I have to teach my students that information is not necessarily true. Because they think you get information, well, that's something significant. Information is often false. Right. So I'm sorry, that's not a very warm response, I think, to your question. Your question is very serious indeed. It's very serious indeed. But what we need to do is practice holding people responsible when they say things that are contrary to all the natural laws we know. Now, you know, there's a long discussion there, and I'm just really skating over the abyss in the way I'm replying to you, but the important thing is, check it out. Check it out. Someone says, miracles can occur. Say, well, now, how'd you get that?
I have purchased a copy of your book, and on pages 132, you refer to George Bernard Shaw,
Yes.
Catholic universities,
Right.
and how they may be very secular today.
Right.
That's a coincidence, because last night I was here at a meeting for the Thomas Aquinas College or University,
Right.
which professes to reject all federal funds so it can teach the Catholic religion
Right.
purely incorrectly. And I've noticed that there are one or two other Catholic universities.
Right.
Would you suggest that this is a way of moving in the direction you'd like to see us move, if it was done by Protestant or other Quaker universities, et cetera, and as a means of introducing religion back and taking away from the secular university, as the Thomas Aquinas College? Are you familiar with them?
Oh, yes, indeed. I've done
And,
accreditation work for St. Thomas Aquinas out in California.
Well, that's my question, sort of a vague question, but do you think there's any hope in that movement in that direction for religion in America?
I think actually you couldn't tell at that point. It would depend on what they do after that. You see, if they present what they teach as knowledge, then they need to provide the basis for it. And in many cases, it may not be there. And you could have a university that just degenerated back into authoritarian statements about what people must believe if they're going to be a member of the group. So this might be an initial step, but I think honestly, honest about me, I think my honest opinion is that most schools that take that step don't do that. You may not know, but some years ago, a lot of Baptist schools took that same posture. But then when their sources from other quarters drew up and professors became more expensive, many of them broke their dependence on the denomination so that they could accept federal funds. So I think that there's something right in this, but we don't know enough about it to say, yes, this is what we need. What we really need is people in these positions who earnestly stick to the idea that you should have evidence for what you believe and say that supports it, at least so far as to make it plausible. And that is a general failing among Christians, is they don't stand by that. And they should. You can't imagine Jesus himself saying, well, that's better than what we teach, but you better stay with Christianity. If you think that about him, you probably won't follow him. Right? So we need to go further than that.
Dr. Willard, thank you. I'm going to go for the short and sweet here. But in your notes, you say that only knowledge lays a foundation for tolerance. And my question is tolerance enough?
Tolerance is not enough, but it's good. And the truth is, like the old song, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. You know. Everybody talking about tolerance ain't tolerant. Right? And we really need to look at that carefully. Tolerance is not enough. It will never substitute for genuine love and caring for people. And we now live in a nation that is sick with justice without love. And justice alone never does justice to justice. You have to have a lot more. And what you have to have is genuine love of neighbor and humility and kindness and a kind of trust that allows you to be relaxed in your world so that you will not have to jump at people who disagree with you. Right? You've got to have a worldview that supports tolerance. And my little point here tonight is simply, if you do not believe in knowledge of values, you'll never have that. You may have a legal system that supports forms of it. And see, the truth about ethics is always you can never reduce it to actions. Laws govern actions. Now we're beginning to try to push further, and we have this interesting category called hate crimes. So if you kill your wife, make sure you don't hate her. Your sentence will be worse. Actually, that wouldn't even count as hate in our categorization. I'm sorry, I get carried away here. Someone else?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Willard. I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I follow you when you say that spirituality as a category can be a matter of knowledge, but I'm not as sure I follow about can we distinguish among different kinds of spirituality on the basis of knowledge? This is maybe an earlier question touched on this with the Wiccans.
Right.
I mean, I take it many people in the room are Christians who would say they know Jesus Christ is God. There are many people who are very reasonable, who are not Christians, who know Jesus Christ is not God. Well, and I wonder if we can really distinguish these different spiritual traditions on the basis of knowledge. Thank you.
That's a very important question, and my first answer is simply we have to look at the details. If hanging a pyramid over a copy machine will keep it from malfunctioning, that's an interesting piece of knowledge. I've got a few machines. I'd be glad to try that on. Right? So the question is the details, and this is where we have to look at them. If you have the Christian who says they know that Christ is God and the non-Christian who says, well, he isn't, then you have to look at the details. And faithful following of reason, experimentation, testing of hypotheses and so on, that's just a part of the spiritual life. Did you know? Logic is spiritual. It isn't physical. It's spiritual because it deals with the laws of truth and evidence. And we need to train ourselves in that. But you'll be hard put to find any university or college today that requires basic logic of its graduates. They will not do it. A lot of reasons for that, but it's just a fact. Yes.
Dr. Willard, I'm interested in your take on spirituality, and spiritual is not bodily.
Yes.
Although I agree with you that, but although the mind is separate from the brain, although the brain is the source of the mind, but we also know that the physical experiences that we have affect the brain and then affect the mind. So how can spirituality be totally non-bodily if our actions, which are, of course, in the physical universe, affect the brain, which affect the mind?
Well, that's a question of evidence again. You have to examine the details. And now, if you are a person who says, well, the mind is the brain, then there's nowhere to go except learn more about the brain. But here's a problem with that. If all you knew was the physical facts of the brain, you wouldn't know there is such a thing as experience or consciousness. You can examine the brain at any level of analysis you wish. You will never find a thought. You will never find a memory. Now, if you have got someone who is conscious of their experience and you start poking around in their brain, they can tell you when what you're doing makes a difference to their experience. But if you don't have the inside view of the individual to their experiences, all you learn is what is happening physically to the brain. So there is obviously a connection. By the way, I don't say it is not bodily, I say it is unbodily. Consciousness and the spiritual is unbodily. That is to say, it does not derive in its nature and existence from what is physical. Now that's a long philosophical argument. And today, of course, you may know that in the field of neurology, people are discovering that the thoughts can actually change the physical structure of the brain. So Descartes and Plato, who are the bad guys in this whole discussion now, was onto something. Not what he thought about the exact interaction point in the pineal gland or any of that, but he was right in thinking there is two-way causation. For example, none of you came here tonight by the laws of physics. You came here because of consciousness. You thought, you felt, you had ideas, desires, and you chose to come here. A leaf might have blown in by the laws of physics. You didn't, right? Your consciousness brought you here. Now you can say, well, it has to be the brain. Well, why? Especially since consciousness does not have the properties of the brain, and the brain doesn't have the properties of consciousness. Now this is stuff that, you know, we hassle over endlessly in philosophy, but it's simply a fact. The properties of consciousness are not properties of the brain. And all you have to do is describe the consciousness to see that. And there are kind of fundamental things that always come up in a philosophical discussion. For example, your thought is about something. Your brain is not about anything. Chemical process is not about anything. Your thoughts are. What you treasure in another person is not their brain. No one has ever dealt with another person as if they were their brain. Think about what that means. See if you can even imagine it. What I treasure in another person, I do not know by knowing their brain. I know them by engaging them in conversation, sharing thoughts, sharing experiences, and so on. And that's what I love and treasure in another person. That's where rights come from. Duties come from. They don't come from the brain. Now you say, well, you've got to be wrong, Willard. Okay, then my question comes, get a thought out of a brain. Do it. I don't object. What I object to is promising things you can't cash. So if you have promises about what the brain can do, let's see the cash. Okay? See, we're in a period now where we're desperate to understand human beings. And we don't know how to understand them. And in particular, we don't know how to control them. And let me tell you, one of the reasons why the government is very interested in funding brain research is to control human beings. Now, you may think that's too spooky and so on. You just stay with us, okay? That's the interest that the government has. They're not into pure research. They don't use your tax dollars to titillate people with brilliant ideas. They use it to promote the aims of government. And the aims of government are always control. That's why the ultimate appeal of government is always to death. And you take the threat of death away from government, and government is impossible. That's one reason why you may want to be thankful that someday there will be no more human government. It won't disappear because property is transferred into the possession of nobody, and everyone just loves one another and gets along. It will disappear because it will not be needed, since there's someone and some people who are able to administer government in a way that does not depend on death. I'm sorry, I got way off there.
We always end on time, so we've really got just a few more minutes. I doubt we're going to get to everyone, so those of you who are there, ask your questions. We'll do our best.
Dr. Willard, thank you for your talk. I'm a philosophy major myself, and I fight with my professors a lot about this point, like that rationality comes from spirituality. Would it be correct to say that knowledge, truth, logic has to come from the spirit because the spirit doesn't want to be hurt? We shouldn't hurt another person. And it's pretty simple, like to do the right thing. That's my question.
No, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Knowledge, truth, and logic. It has to come from the spirit because the spirit does not want to be hurt.
Well, I think the spirit has a lot of interest beyond being hurt or not being hurt. See, that's a picture of value that is narrower, I think, than the realities. And I think you find that people are quite willing to be hurt for the sake of other things that they think are more important than not being hurt. That, of course, is a spiritual factor itself, because choice and valuing and so on are matters of the spirit.
I understand that point, like growth. Yeah, growing, like embarrassing yourself to grow or things like that, like to hurt yourself for growth. But then you said that truth comes from the spirit, then what other guidance can the spirit give you other than not to hurt somebody else or to respect humanity, period?
Well, for example, the spirit can reach out for beauty, and it does that. It does that in little children. And that's more than just not being hurt. I mean, you look at a building like this. Why is it here? Why does it have the properties that it does? Because someone loved beauty, and they were willing to pay for it, right? Because you had to pay for it. So I'm not sure that I have appreciated exactly what you're saying. There's just a lot more to the spiritual life than not being hurt.
Well, that's where existentialism comes from, isn't it?
Existentialism comes from the idea that all values come from choice, and choice does not come from values.
And experience and what it does to people.
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'm just not understanding. They said that you're including my point, but I just don't hear it, so okay, I'll think on it. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Dr. Willard, you define spirituality by saying that it's manifested in things like self-awareness, art, and morality. And these are all objective realities that most people can relate to and can discuss, even though they may not agree. But what my skeptical coworker tomorrow morning really wants to ask is not about these things. They want to get to the point. How can an intelligent human being believe in a transcendental spiritual being, eternal being, such as the God of the Bible? I know that's a bigger question than a 3-minute response can allow for, but how do you begin that conversation?
Yeah, well,
That's what they think of when they think about a spirituality and
I begin by
reason
pointing
compatible.
out that people when they believe things, may believe them because of factors that have influenced them. Many people, for example, believe what they believe because they were raised in a certain family. It's possibly true that if I had been raised in another country, I would have been a Buddhist and not a Christian. That's a causal explanation. It's important, but it's not very helpful if you're interested in truth, because people pick up beliefs like a suit picks up lint. You know, they pick up beliefs, okay? Now, the question of whether or not the beliefs are true is not a question of causation. It's a question of evidence. And so when you ask the very proper question, how can a person believe? You have to say, well, you follow the evidence. If you follow the evidence, you can come to a belief. Now, again, I'm saying that's how you would start. Then you have to fill that in. Because whether or not that is true is, of course, among your colleagues and others, is a big question. So you have to follow the evidence. And there's no substitute for that. And you have to understand that if you don't want to know something, you don't have to. Knowledge does not grab you by the throat and jump down. That's true of algebra, knowledge of Russian novels, theology. If you want knowledge, you have to seek it. And if in approaching a question, you sense that something is coming around the logical corner that you don't want, you can stop. You don't have to pay attention. Right? If you don't want to know something, you don't have to. And that is true for many things, not just in theology, personal relationships, business deals. People don't want to know something. And they see the evidence is coming around the corner, and they close their eyes. That's not a good way to live. So I would say you have to follow the evidence. That would be my short answer. My long answer would be a series of meetings with such an individual if they were willing to go through that and say, now, do you see how this follows from that, or that doesn't follow from that, and so forth. That's the hard work. And that's the work that Christians tend not to be willing to do. But if we're going to stand in the world and represent knowledge, that's what we have to do. Well, thank you. Thank you.
We have time for just one more question, I'm afraid.
I'll try and make this quick. And thank you again, Dr. Willard, for your wonderful presentation this evening.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to just bring a question to you regarding the response to the current discourse regarding what I consider to be false dichotomies being established in that discourse, where people say you're either believing in reason or you're believing in spiritual things. You either have faith or reason, whatever
Right.
that might be. And I appreciate the way in which you've separated those as independent dimensions of life, along with many other dimensions of life. Could you just comment, please, on how we can best carry on our dialogues with people who are adopting that worldview that Dawkins and others have perpetuated?
You have actually returned us to the very topic that we started with. Thank you. And we have two kinds of people like that, those who go with the spirituality and then those who want to go with the reason. And it's hard to say anything general about this because you're going to have to pay attention to the individuals you're talking to find a place to start the discussion. And so if I were talking with someone who thought you had to side with reason against spirituality, I would ask them to tell me about reason. And I would follow carefully, sympathetically what they said. And I believe that if I did that and asked loving, kind, intelligent questions at the right place, they could very well come to learn that reason is spiritual. I think the same thing is true for the people on the other side who often may say things, oh, well, I just believe the Bible, or something of that sort. There again, you have to say things like, well, tell me about that. You might begin to ask, which Bible? And how does the truth come through that? And how do you get at it? And so on. And I would, I believe, be able to show them they could not do that without reason. That's how I would approach it. And what I want to say is that you need both of them, and you need to follow them faithfully. And you can't do that if you fundamentally distrust the other from the start. And the great cry of the Christian movement, if you wish, in this age is to put them together and not distance them. Because if you do that, you will misunderstand both of them. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very kind. Thank you.